All right, so in this video, we're going to continue looking at the new imperialism, but here we're going to look at the new imperialism in Africa. So just like we saw in India and China and Japan, Europeans had been involved in African economies for centuries. I mean, if we go back to like the ideas of triangular trade, and the Atlantic slave trade, but even if we go before that, we could even think about the trans-Saharan trade routes. So Europeans had been involved in African economies for a really long time. If we think about things like triangular trade and the slave trade, that's more recent to where we are, but we could think about going back all the way to like the 8 to 900s when the camel was introduced into Africa, linking Eurasia now to Africa. Industrialization allowed Europeans to travel in Africa to places that they had never been able to go before. So if we think about things like the steamboat, which allows them to go upriver instead of just following a river's current, or if we think about all the medicine, these things allow Europeans to go places in Africa that they weren't really able to go to before. So now there are more and more Europeans who are setting up in the interior of Africa. So because of industrialization, Europeans are now able to go places in Africa in larger numbers than they were ever able to do before. The big change, the turning point here, happens in the 1870s. In the 1870s, we see a global economic crisis. And the reasons for which aren't really that important, but the short story is that the price of silver dropped, and silver was what everybody still used for their own currencies. And so if the price of silver drops, so does the value of your own money. And the African economies were hurt especially bad because they sold raw materials. And if people don't have money to buy raw materials, then you're not getting any money. But the Europeans, being as devious as they are, they allowed, or they opened up new economic opportunities for the Africans, in the same way that they opened up new economic opportunities for the Chinese, or they opened up new economic opportunities for the Ottomans. And this is just going to lead to European control of African economies. Except this is actually going to result in colonization rather than just spheres of influence. And there are a number of reasons for this. There's a cultural or a racist reasoning. But it's also just cheaper for the Europeans to extract raw materials themselves. And so as we get into the 1880s, Europeans are carving up the African map the same way they carved up China. And this is known as the scramble for Africa. All the Europeans are kind of fighting amongst themselves to get as much Africa as they can get their hands on. So in 1884, the Germans, and we'll talk about the Germans here in a second, the Germans organize the Berlin Conference to set up the rules for African colonization. So there were some rules for doing this. You had to actually have people on the ground in the African territory you're claiming with proof. And you had to be actively improving the land, meaning you had to be building stuff on it. Like, I don't know, railroads, for instance. Okay, so for those of us that haven't gone through the German and Italian unification stuff, those videos are in the YouTube channel if you want to watch them yourself. But just a quick recap of what was happening. In the 1860s, Italian and German leaders used nationalism to unite the pieces of their countries into unified nation states. So this process happened in 1861 for Italy and in 1871 for Germany. So pretty much the same kind of process that led to Latin American independence also put Italy together and Germany together, even though they're not really fighting against a colonial power. They're just using nationalism to unite all the Italians and unite all the Germans into one big nation state. And so it's the Germans who are doing this. And so over the 1880s and 1890s, the Europeans take over as much of Africa as they can hold. So we have the British kind of going north and south, kind of from Egypt in the north all the way down to South Africa. The French kind of go west to east across the Sahara. There was an example of one African country beating back the Europeans, and that was the Italians. Were defeated in Ethiopia in the 1890s. Eventually, Italy will overwhelm the Ethiopians in 1936, but for the time being, the Italians were defeated by Africans, and this story is kind of the one of the bases for Wakanda in the Marvel universe. So that's kind of a historical basis for Black Panther. Maybe the worst example of European imperialism in Africa happened in a place called the Belgian Congo. So the Belgian Congo is the modern Democratic Republic of the Congo. So it's a big country right in the middle of Africa. And this was essentially a giant rubber plantation. And I'm using the word plantation on purpose because the Belgians pretty much enslaved the entire population to produce rubber. So instead of going and buying slaves, the Belgians just enslaved the entire population of Central Africa to produce rubber for them. Now, this was the personal property of the King of Belgium, King Leopold II. So it was his personal property. It was not governed by the Belgian government. So there was no oversight. No one protected the Africans. So even the British and the French, when they colonized an area, they made sure that there weren't like horrible violations and crimes being committed. Or at least that was the idea. If somebody committed a crime against people in a colony, essentially there would be some sort of punishment for that. Not here. To the rest of the world, the Belgian Congo was a free trade zone. Anyone could trade there. And the Belgians made a point of promoting the good they were doing for Africa. So they made a big point of talking about building schools and railroads and providing clean water. So to the rest of the world, it looks like Belgium is doing a good thing. And of course, building schools and railroads and providing clean water, these are things that we still try to do for underdeveloped countries. However, there was a very dark side to this. Like I said, they pretty much enslaved the entire population. So, behind this was a program of forced labor with brutal punishments if certain quotas for rubber production were not met. And usually these were things like amputations, like they would just cut off hands and arms and feet. They would kill family members. If you didn't bring in enough rubber. So it was about as bad as anything we might see in the Western Hemisphere with the sugar production. It was that bad. So basically, this is like using terrorism to produce rubber. Eventually, all of this was pieced together by a British investigative journalist named E.D. Morel. Because this was a really closely guarded secret. The Belgians did not let any of this stuff out. But Morel basically like followed the money and visited the Belgian Congo to write his story. And it was a huge scandal for the Belgians. And really famous celebrities of the time, like guys like Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories, and Mark Twain, led a public opinion campaign against Leopold. And by the early 1900s, the Belgian government took over the colony, which isn't really that much better, but it is better than it being a giant rubber plantation with no oversight. So at least now there are some protections. It's not a lot better, but it's better than it was. So baby steps, I guess. Now, one last point I'm going to make here is that even though there were rules for African colonization, that doesn't mean that there weren't still conflicts. So there were still some conflicts that emerged. And one example of this is something called the Fascoda Crisis in 1898. And basically this corresponds to these two axes of Africa that the French and British were trying to create. So remember, the British were trying to create a north-south axis through Africa, and the French were trying to create this west to east axis. And eventually they were going to meet. So the two nations crossed at a place called Fascoda, which is in modern South Sudan. So kind of in East Central Africa. Now, when the soldiers met, they were friendly. Like, they didn't really want to fight each other. The soldiers met, they were friendly. The French were outnumbered. Ten to 1. So there were 10 British soldiers for every French soldier. But they weren't really looking for a fight. They just kind of happened upon each other and they just started hanging out. Their governments, however, in Europe almost started a war. But in the end, the French backed down. And the reason the French backed down is because they realized they couldn't win. They didn't want to fight the British Navy. And, kind of looking ahead to where we're just about to get to, if they were going to fight someone, it was probably going to be Germany. ... Because World War I is just about to break out, and the French and the Germans are already kind of itching to fight again. So we'll stop there. We've got one more video on the new imperialism, and we're going to talk about some of these new imperial powers. So we'll talk a little bit more about Japan, we'll talk about the United States, and we'll talk about one special case of nationalism involving the Jewish people and what they're going to do to try to defend themselves against the almost always present fear of anti-Semitism. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.